What is the economic impact if we were to accelerate research on women's health?
Since 1995, over 50,000 articles have been published on the human brain, shedding light on the most complex organ in the human body. But of those 50,000 articles, less than half of 1% focus on health factors specific to women.
When we think about women's health, we need to think beyond the reproductive organs.
Women are more likely to be sent home from an emergency department while having a heart attack than men, and they are more likely to die in the first year after a heart attack. How is it possible that we do not have the knowledge, diagnosis, and treatments to save the lives of women?
You know, we rely on science to solve our biggest problems. Why would you want to even risk shutting out the ideas of half of your population to solve those problems?
Exclusion of any group in clinical research holds back the health and wealth of our society.
Women's health needs innovation and creativity. It needs everybody to look at it in a new way.
It shouldn't be 30 more years, but it should be 3 years.
Welcome. We're delighted that you're able to join us for our dialogue, the first of 2025. And this one will be focusing on heart disease, the #1 killer of women, and an area in which WHAM has had significant, I hope, impact in certainly advocating for greater research and investment. WHAM, as you know, is a 501c3 that's focused on accelerating the economic impact of research and investment for women. Heart disease was one of the first areas that we studied when we did our first reports with the RAND Corporation. And of course, for us, it was a real eye-opener to see that NIH allocated 4% of their budget to heart disease. I think that started us off on a campaign to make sure that we included heart as well as brain cancer and cardiovascular disease as the 4 areas that we began with. And of course, now, you know, we have also included investment with our new report that focuses on the business case for showing why we need to be able to create greater investment than the 2% that we're currently doing. So our first reports focus very much on research. This report is very much focused on investment. And with that, I want to say how thrilled I am to be able to be with 4 extraordinary people and professionals involved in heart and women's heart disease. And several of them obviously have become good friends and partners of WHAM, and for that, we're very appreciative. We have a researcher, a clinician, an entrepreneur, and an investor intentionally. What we're trying to show is that we need to go from the research into the clinic, into the entrepreneurship and the start of business ideas, and ultimately the investment that's going to convert those ideas into modalities that can improve the life of women. I don't know in 2025 how we are still lacking the diagnostics, the treatments, or the investment needed to protect all of the women in our lives, and obviously the men as well, but in this case, we're focused today on women. And I'm always amazed that 45% of women over 20 have some kind of cardiovascular disease. So we know that this is an area in which we need to spend a great deal of time, energy, and focus. And with that, I think I would like to begin, because I know aside from hearing from me, you really do want to hear from these experts. And I'm going to start with our researcher, with Dr. Martha Galati, because first of all, she has done a recent study that particularly piqued my curiosity on exercise. And I would love, Martha, for you to talk a little bit about that, as well as your role in research and what that has meant to you.
Yeah, so thank you for having me here. And I think this is such an important topic. I love the 3, not 30, because I feel like I've had this career in cardiology for almost 30 years. And we've been talking about the same thing and not moving the needle. And I think we haven't studied enough about women, and that's what we're all here to discuss. But I am both a clinician and a researcher, and my focus has always been on both women and sex differences. I think we need to know both. We need to know things specifically about women, but we also need to know how men and women differ. And so sometimes our trials, our studies will be exclusively on women, but sometimes it's important for us to study both sexes to really understand what is different. Now, you alluded to our study that we published actually almost a year ago now. And it was a study published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. And we looked at people from the US population, over 400,000 men and women. And we looked at the effect of exercise on mortality, but particularly cardiovascular mortality. And what we were able to find, of course, it's not rocket science, that women and men who exercise are more likely to live longer. That's not new, but what was new was that actually women got more out of every minute of exercise than men, which is actually good news. We usually have so much bad news in the cardiovascular research world for women, but this is one time that we get more out of every minute of exercise. And perhaps even when we make assumptions that are, the recommended amount of exercise, should it be the same for men and women? I don't know if that answer is actually really that it should be the same. It currently is the same. We need a little bit more work in this area, but this is why we need research, because research has the potential to add to our knowledge base and ultimately change our guidelines when appropriate.
So, which is fascinating to me, but I guess I'm curious, why has women's cardiovascular disease remained so under-researched? And then how does this relate to the research that you do? And how is it that how is it that we're going to be able to shift? What is it that we need to do to be able to shift this paradigm?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. Why is really part of me is like, why? We've been asking this for years. Where are the women? And that's what we should be asking about every study that we see out there. But one of the biggest reasons that affected enrollment in studies really had to do with something that happened in the 1960s. Some of you may remember this drug called thalidomide was used for morning sickness without really any studies. And unfair to women, because of course women might use something for morning sickness. Who wants morning sickness? But we didn't know the devastating consequences to the offspring. So almost immediately the FDA said women of childbearing age will not be included in trials. And maybe that was okay, but the problem is it got translated to the medical community like women should not be included in trials. And so we've been spending, as you've already said, the last 20, 30 years trying to rectify that particular issue. We did have a woman leader of the NIH, Dr. Bernadine Healy in the 90s served, and she was a cardiologist too. And she actually was the one that really said, where are the women? What are we going to do to get women into trials? And now we need to change things. We can't be ignoring them and excluding them. Things did change, but it took quite a bit of time really to get people to be accountable. And I'd still say that there's a lack of accountability in the medical community about inclusion of 51% of the population. We still struggle. We still see studies at our national meetings that get presented with no women or 10% women, 20% of women. And this really needs to change. There needs to be accountability. If you're funded, whether it's through pharma, whether it's through the National Institute of Health, there should be guardrails that if you are not enrolling enough women, you stop enrolling the men. This is how funding needs to be directed so that we change this conversation and move the needle to inclusion.
Yeah, well, let me segue. Thank you for that thoughtful answer and information and update, because all of it is so appropriate, and there are so many issues that we could take and really expand on from what you just said. Let me move to Stacy, who has just been, I'm so proud of, who has been named not just the volunteer president of the American Heart Association. So she's now wearing many hats, obviously, or president-elect, and WHAM is honored to partner with Northwell Health and with Stacy And we have been great partners over the past couple of years, almost since WHAM started. So I've gotten to know Stacy well and understand that she's a fierce advocate for women's heart health. But Stacy, I've also heard frustration in your voice at times, and incomprehension that we're still in the same place that we were 30 years ago. And I don't want to say exactly the same place, but we haven't made the kinds of strides, as even Martha has alluded to, that we all need to make, given that we are 51% of the population, as we've said. So you've spent more than 30 years with women's cardiovascular disease. You've watched the misdiagnosis happen over and over. You know that there are tools, that diagnostics and devices that are missing. How do you deal with all of this? And what is it that we can all do to support you to make heart disease not the #1 killer?
Thanks, Carolee. And first, there's nothing I love more than being on a panel with Martha Galati, who's been an absolute warrior for this for ages, both in the science, the clinical, and the advocacy. And I'm thrilled to be on the panel today because there are days that, as Martha alluded to a bit, that this has been, a conversation that we've been having for decades, yet there are some days that, as you and I joke, Carolee, we're still pushing the same rocks up the hill, and having them come down upon us. So heart disease remains the #1 killer of women. We are sliding backwards in the percentage of women who even know that. Martha and her team have done some work about the level of comfort that primary care clinicians have in navigating and taking care of these women. So it's kind of the perfect storm of, we haven't educated our clinical colleagues, our clinicians, about not just the risk to women, but the opportunities longstanding across a woman's lifespan. Women still are not aware that this is a predominantly preventable condition that is their #1 risk. We've learned so much more about some of the cardiovascular wellness opportunities also impact on healthy aging and brain health and cognition. So, these are all, important things to know about. And we don't educate our medical students, nursing students, really to see that sex as a biologic variable is foundational to everything we do. So rather than being frustrated, we continue to, fight the good fight and go at it on multiple cylinders. And that's why the beauty of this, multidisciplinary panel is so important. So we want to get the word out to every woman that her opportunities to start having a long, healthy, a heart disease-free life begins in your teens and 20s. And that means learning about your risk, learning about life's essential ACE and other things that Martha and the preventive cardiologists refer to as primordial prevention. What can we do as young individuals to prevent even getting the risk factors that can ultimately lead to heart disease and other cardiovascular issues? It's partnerships with our gynecologists so that young women start young, and that it's not just the GYN organs, but that this becomes a process. It's understanding that pregnancy-related issues are not concerns that should stay in an obstetrician's office. Those are things that become part of an individual's story. Midlife and menopause requires more awareness, more advocacy, more research. And our older women we're spending, a third of our lives post-menopause. We need to understand more carefully what's unique about women's heart health. After that, we need to train doctors and nurses in new ways, that learning to focus on women's issues uniquely, whether it's their societal role as gender or their biology as sex, is critical. And then it's teaching women to be proactive, that, women become fierce lionesses when they're taking a parent or a sibling or a spouse or a child to a doctor, but we're meek and we don't really empower ourselves or feel able to really demand the care and the workups and the evaluations that we need. So I think the biggest message for me is that this needs to be firing throughout. Dr. Wenger used to still speaks about educate, investigate, advocate, legislate, that we all need to be in this. And I will add invest if, for those on the call, or for your work, Carolee. But this has to be the responsibility, the role, the opportunity, the honor, actually, of all of us.
And so well stated. And I know you and I and others have had this conversation where a woman will, like you said, you're taking your kids, you're taking your husband, and we take care of everyone else. But, you have, let's say I woke up this morning and I have slight indigestion, I have pain in my shoulder, can't tell exactly, I don't feel 100% right, but I really don't feel right. And instead of perhaps doing something about it, I'll just brush it off. What is it that scare us a little bit and tell us when we have symptoms, instead of saying, no, it's a mild, it's nothing, it's just indigestion, it's just this, it's just that. Why and how do we get women to realize that heart disease or a heart attack, really the symptoms are quite different, and we're not going to necessarily get that crushing blow to the chest? Can you give a little primer on that?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying that I think the best thing each of us can do, and bother your sisters and girlfriends and every female in your life, is to have a primary care physician who knows you over a lifetime. And I know that's often hard to do, but somebody who can start in your early ages to identify early prevention strategies, identify experiences that you may have, that you can then call somebody and say, I'm having this on the treadmill, and your clinician will know that this is worrisome or that isn't. So having a primary care physician, I think, is important. Secondly, we know that women get traditional chest pain as often as men. But what they are more likely is to have other symptoms, either concomitantly or sometimes at different times. So the back pain, the shortness of breath, even the fuzzy head or the jaw discomfort. So certainly no woman should ever, ignore the classic. And we don't call it typical anymore. Thank you, Dr. Galati. We call it, I teasingly call it classic. I think that a woman should know that when she has anything that seems different, and women have that sixth sense, that they shouldn't ignore it. And if you have a primary care clinician who knows you, who's really your partner in optimizing health, then it's a quick phone call, it's a text, it's a note to an electronic health record. Hey, what do you think? Yes, I had Mexican food, but I'm not feeling good on the treadmill today. And I think feeling allowed to put yourself first on your to-do list, and not being afraid of wasting someone's time or the outcome, but just think of the way you would navigate a complaint with a loved one. Navigate it the same way for yourself.
Yeah, such great advice. Yeah, thank you for that. We'll come back. I've got a couple of more questions, but I really want to move to Alicia. And Alicia, I would love for you to talk and describe a little bit about what you do and what you've created and the company that you've created and the devices and the thoughts that you have about how what you are producing can change heart health in women. We might have lost Alicia. So Lisa, while we're trying to find Alicia, let's flip.
Okay.
And let's talk a little bit about your background, which I was fascinated about when we had a call a couple of weeks ago, and the new role that you're playing at the American Heart Association, although you've been there before. But catch us up a little bit on what you're doing and why you feel it's so exciting and important.
Yeah, thank you so much, Carolee, for having me here today. And it's great to see some of my colleagues on the clinical side. I am the managing partner of American Heart Association Ventures, which is a program of 4 different venture initiatives, all focused on investing in companies that improve cardiovascular and brain health, aligned with the mission of the Heart Association. One of those funds in particular is focused on the women's health lens. So thinking about cardiovascular and brain health from that lens, things that are differentiated in women, things that disproportionately affect women, things that affect only women. My background for many years has been on the venture side, although I've been an entrepreneur and I've been a big company person and I've been a strategy consultant as well. But in the end, I keep coming back to this issue of wanting to improve cardiovascular and brain health because it's so prevalent and so many other things are connected to it. And I think that's actually one of the things women often don't realize is that the heart in particular is not a standalone organ, that it is affected by menopause, endometriosis, all sorts of things that happen to you in your life, lupus, gastrointestinal disorders in some cases, all sorts of things that can really drive problems around cardiovascular disease as well as brain health. And, we have an opportunity, I think, to help support the translation of science to action. I've always appreciated the scientists that bring things forward and find those innovations, but unless you bring them to commercial use in the clinic or in other forms, they don't end up having the impact they could. So that's my focus.
So why has there been such little investment in women's heart health? When you look, especially as we found when we did our first studies, that only 4%, and the other disease areas that we studied were 15, 12, and 7%. Why has heart disease in particular received such little investment?
I think, heart disease has been generally, not even just women's, but generally has been on the decline, funding of heart disease interventions, in part because medical devices are a key part of it. And those have been on the decline for 15 years, investment in that space, because the difficulties in getting them funded and supported by payers and others and adopted and get through the FDA is just a very difficult field and takes a lot. Digital health has made many attempts at improving cardiovascular disease, and that's great and continues to do so. But a lot of that really hasn't been supported by adequate science to demonstrate efficacy and value. I think there's a lot of challenge on the women's health focused company side that most of the people that review deals like me are men, not women. And who, if they came up through the medical ranks, they also weren't trained in thinking about women's health differently. If they came up through the business ranks, they probably had no awareness of those issues or very little, like most people do. Their exposure, if they're especially on the younger side, isn't necessarily strong to these issues. I also think that women's health companies, just to be fair, have gotten a little bit of a break or at least trying to get a break and thinking about themselves as something that's for good. And you can't think about it in the investor world that way. You got to think about it as an economic endeavor where returns matter more than anything. And so thinking about business models and how things get paid and the quality of the team and the quality of the clinical study that's done to prove out the idea need to be A+, more A+ than even the A+ and outside of women's health, because there is a barrier. And oftentimes we see companies that, are talking about why it's right, which of course it is, but that's not good enough, to get an investment.
What would be, it's 3 years from now or 2 years from now. We love 3 Not 30, obviously, which is why we brought together a group of leading professionals from all different parts of the ecosystem to try to figure out what could we change in 3 years, not 30. If it was 3 years from today or from the day that you started, what would be success for you?
Well, I think, one of the key things we have to do is get payers to recognize that this is an important population for them to be thinking about. And so they're looking for opportunities to address their own medical loss ratios and costs while addressing some of the women's health issues they don't often think about. So really giving awareness to the payer side. I think educating the providers so they're looking for solutions to deliver to their patients is really important. I mean, all the way back to medical school, I think as I wasn't sure, I don't remember if it was Martha or Stacy said it, but we need to be raising awareness actively and programmatically. But I think, the biggest thing that will make a big difference is getting some of these companies through to the end, through the end, meaning to exit, to demonstrate the returns. We are seeing a lot of companies not succeed right now because they're, young and struggle to get money, but also because they're, using business models that don't really fly in our healthcare system. And we need to see companies build on tried and true models that can get to successful exits so more money will flow into the space.
That's a great point. In the WHAM report that we just did issue in January, that is the business case for investment. One of our slides that is one of my favorites shows that there were 31 exits over the past 5 years. There were 4 IPOs and 35 exits, 4 IPOs and 31 mergers and acquisitions. So it is an area that is proving itself as a profitable investment. I encourage everyone to take a look at the report because there is data like that. There are success stories. I hear you and I agree with what you're saying. On the other hand, like was said earlier, I need to point to the successes and to the good things that are happening. So, and with that, and I think it's amazing what you're doing, and I can't wait to help and encourage in any way I can. Alicia, I think we have you back, and now that we do, you're one of those case studies that is a wonderful story. Tell us about your company and why you started it and where it's at right now in its growth cycle.
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. It is, like Stacy said, such an honor to be part of this conversation because to give you a little bit of context, I came to the US. I'm originally from Costa Rica 10 years ago in 2015 to pursue my graduate studies at MIT. And I was part of MIT's computational cardiovascular research group. And there I got exposed to look, thanks to having a PI that heard me when I had access to all of these landmark studies and raw data that is used today for clinical decision making. They heard me when I said, hey, but there's barely data for women. I'm curious. All of us in the lab are working on machine learning and AI tools and algorithms. How is this going to impact women? And they let me pursue that type of research. And I had access to look at studies from Dr. Gulati to learn about the Gulati formula on heart rate and exercise. And I saw a lot of things, a lot of evidence over the last 20 years on sex differences. And when we were studying sex differences in computational digital biomarkers, we realized the biggest problem is we don't have data from women. And even in the big data sets, when we have big data, we have big noise when it comes to the limited data we have for women, because women have breast tissue and all of these different things that devices that exist today aren't designed around female physiology. So we really decided to do something about it, and we've created Bloomer Tech, which is to accelerate the progress on women's health using all of this evidence and all of this research that we had. Because the reality is that we see artificial intelligence as something that is going to inflectionally change the way we provide healthcare to people in the next few years, and it could either perpetuate existing problems where women it's harder to recognize, diagnose, and treat women, or it could actually fix the problems because we're accelerating our pace of changes in cardiovascular care for women. So we decided to go all in on making change, and what we built is wearable medical devices that integrate seamlessly into a bra. And so our patented technology is textile-based sensors, and it collects huge amounts of data around her torso from her heart, her lungs, her hormones, and her metabolism. So we call it the Bloomer Tag, and we've been very excited to work on this so that we can accelerate and get all of this missing data on women across the different stages of her life. We think about it very intentionally, how we build these data sets, thinking about a menstruating woman at pregnancy and postpartum stage, and postmenopausal women, because as Dr. Rosen mentioned, right, there's all of these variables that often don't get to be part of the models that give you very good resolution of what's going on over the different stages of her life.
So tell me where you are in your mind in the life cycle of your business.
Yeah, so we're an early stage company. We started back in 2020. It was when we raised our first round of funding. And we've been able to, bear in mind, that was also the day that, the year that COVID started. So I remember back in the days, things like going from engineer to engineer, because fortunately all of us lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, so we could go to each other's houses to drop the prototypes. And we've been able all the way to now to manufacture our product at scale, to validate it, test it, and now we've achieved regulatory submission. So we're excited for the next stages where we're going to be able to acquire huge amounts of data from female patients.
And when do you expect this product to be available widely and broadly?
So this is a medical device first. So we're looking to partner with doctors so that they can prescribe our devices end of this year.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, well, that's exciting. So what's been the biggest obstacle for you? Has it been funding?
Yeah, I think one of the things that is interesting, right, is when we started, not even in my wildest dreams would I have a conversation like the one we're having today. So like, thank you for building this ecosystem, because I think for many years, the obstacle has not only been the fact that this area is underfunded from the research side, is that we don't see a space for innovation. I think when we talk about change, we want hard changes, which means we need to drive technological changes to this space. And we've seen the obstacle that sometimes we have to educate investors. We are not fitting exactly in their thesis of their investment fund. And either we're women's health, but we're women's heart health, and they have never done investments in the medical device space, and we have a regulated medical device. Or they do medical devices, but they've never done women's health, right? So there's an interesting intersection. And for the AI and big data companies, right, like they see this exciting opportunity because of the digital biomarker pipeline that we have, but at the same time, they've never done medical regulated devices. So we're like in this very interesting intersection where there's a high opportunity, and we've had to basically justify why we exist to many people until we found the right partners. And I think finding the right partners makes a big difference, especially if they have the experience that you need, because we're small teams. And that's how we have been able to move forward. And from a small team, scale manufacturing, right? Like bring the product to life. And despite the different challenges that COVID posed, like limited supply chains, right? Like all of these threats. And most importantly for us, sticking to our thesis since our inception, because our technology, our sensors, we have been recommended to do consumer products, or we have been recommended to go after fitness and wellness products, but we really have, since our inception, focused on heart health for women. We see the huge potential, and we've been able to work with the patients and women at risk or diagnosed with heart disease, so we know exactly how we're going to build and change that patient journey that exists today.
Well, it's very exciting what you're doing, and I think we're all overly impressed with not only the direction that you've taken, but your ability to make it all happen. You know, Stacey and Martha, I'd love to throw it out to you in terms of innovation, because Alicia said something that I find kind of startling, but not really, is that we lack innovation in many areas. How do you try to work with different people when you see a need, which I'm sure you do, for the kind of innovation that could really shift or change and Lisa, you as well, because you're seeing lots of different companies. Is there enough innovation happening? Because sometimes I get the comment that there's just not enough. There aren't enough companies starting in these areas. There isn't enough innovation, et cetera. I'd love to hear your views on that. And I'm sure people who are listening would like to hear as well.
Well, I can start. I would say that there's a lot of innovation going on, but as Alicia pointed out, not all of it, very little of it, in fact, is directed toward women's heart health. The reason for that, I do think, is a lack of awareness, because people will say to people like Alicia who are bringing these ideas, oh, that's a niche market. Like, we're 51% of the population. That is not a niche market. When this is the #1 killer of men and the #1 killer of women, there's no reason. But there is a lack of awareness. And this has been to me, one of the key things that has held up these issues, is that people are not recognizing that women and their hearts is a real issue. It's not just a few people. When we think about women's health, we always talk about like moving beyond the bikini line, because we think about the breasts, we think about the reproductive system, but all the organs other than that, we don't think about. Why would they be the same? Biologically, if you're XX as a woman and a man is XY, every cell in that body has a sex, and therefore every molecule that interacts with us, every risk that we're exposed to may have a difference. And if we don't describe those differences, if we don't know those differences, we will never get ahead. And then another example is like even devices. We think about women way after the fact, because devices get developed, they come out, and then they don't work in women. They're too big. They don't, for whatever reason, but you didn't study women. So how were we to ever know if these things worked in women?
Well, this is something, of course, that WHAM has been yelling and screaming about since we started. So you're preaching to the choir. We're definitely not a niche market. We have tried to dispel that myth. We are 51% of the population, 52%, I think, of the workforce, make 85% of the spending decisions and 80% of the healthcare decisions. We are not a niche market. In fact, we drive economies. Having said that, the people that will listen to me rant about that part they'll get, the economic part they'll get. The other part that you're talking about, which are the myths, women are not small men, we're different down to the cellular level. Our organ systems are different, our genetics are different. Well, that becomes a little more complex or a little more hard, so what would you like me to do with that? And so it's fascinating to me when I hear you all talk about the lack of awareness or the lack of knowledge. I'm going to throw it back at you. The American Heart Association is a gigantic, wonderful organization that I believe has the ability to educate, inform, teach, lead. And so when you tell me that there isn't enough information, then I will challenge you and say, Stacy, how can WHAM help? How can any woman help to make sure that AHA, Lisa, you're in a new role, to make sure that AHA takes that lead, to make sure that, in fact, all women understand what the prevention strategies are. Do I go see a cardiologist if I have a regular OB-GYN and that's all I have? Tell me what to do. Tell me how to manage my heart health. Tell me what's important. Tell me, et cetera, et cetera. I just wonder, when you have so many, and aside from AHA, there's obviously other women's heart organizations, why I'm fascinated that there's still, because WHAM, even though we keep trying to put out the information as sex is a biological variable, the need to study sex differences, why are we still having the same discussion?
So I thank you. And thank you for pushing rocks, with us. Words matter. And I think despite the decades of all of us talking about women's health, I am still finding myself regularly reminding people that we are going, as Martha said, beyond the bikini, that this isn't. Because even when you look at the venture capital world and investment, even that small percentage of what we're calling women's health is predominantly in the reproductive space. And every time I see that as an equal sign, it makes me even more crazy, because that takes us backwards. So Alicia, thank you for your commitment to what us on this call and so many others think is really the most important thing for women. So I, and I think how we define women's health, and I try never to use a snarky Stacy voice, as my children say, but when I have to remind people that women's health is not reproductive health merely, or the bikini and beyond, I feel like I'm a broken record. But I think that matters, and I also fear that this has predominantly become the I'll say, responsibility of women, scientists, clinicians, investors, legislators, and that's ridiculous. We are 51% of the population. I was at a planning committee meeting a few weeks ago, and a male who I respect, not in the cardiology space, said, well, Stacey, why would this be important to me? And that's when the snarky voice really had to be pushed back. It's important to you because it's, bad science to do it otherwise. It's a bad investment. 51% of your patients, no matter virtually any field you're in, sort of, I don't know, urology, it is your patient population. So this has to be something that is not the responsibility of the women to fix, honestly. And I think the framing of this as improving the health of women, sex is a biologic variable. Listen, if we do this badly, the men get bad science also, right? So this is not something that's a woman's issue. This is health, this is investment. And yes, of course, it's just ethical, it's fair, but
May I add, though, one of the things that I don't think helps on the investment side is some of the generalized numbers, like 85% of decisions in healthcare are made by women.
Mhm.
Okay, but that's not an economic driver specific enough to fund a company. Because when you look at companies, they want to know, the investor wants to know, what's the target market for this product or service? And using generalized numbers like that is easily dismissed and makes it's not as credible. So what you want to show is, yeah, it may be a niche, quote unquote, of people who have menopause, but the niche is 100% of women and they spend money on products. Or the niche is, the number of people who have a particular type of hypertension post-maternity, but that's still a large number. And let me explain to you how that translates to dollars. And I think we have to get more precise because that is how the deals are evaluated. And the generalized stuff, it's like saying the US has the, 35th or whatever number it is, worst health, but it's a public health number, but it's not really a specific healthcare number when you talk about individual providers and things like that. But I think we have to find ways to tell the story more precisely when we're talking about investment. We need to be going where the reimbursement is, not where it isn't, to get some wins. And we have to be really educating the acquirers because most of the acquisitions that have occurred over the last year in women's health weren't great ones, to be honest. They got acquired, but not for large returns. And so we need to help the buyers understand how they actually are already women's health companies in many cases. If you're a pharmaceutical company, something like 80% of all pharmaceutical consumption is by women. So helping them parse their own numbers, helping the payers parse their own numbers to look at the economic impact, if it's a commercial payer, within 12 months of a certain condition, because that's how they're measuring it. The economic return on the investment of a medical payment, is it going to return more than that to me in 12 months? That's how they're looking at it. So you really need to get deep in the numbers and the economics. And I think too often we in our field get too wrapped up in the big numbers that don't really drive acquisition of products and services day to day.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I think you're right. But I'm going to ask you a question. When a group of people were sitting around whatever company was making Viagra and discussing whether the market was large enough for it because it's only 49%, I don't think that happened. So
no, probably not, but they probably looked at it even more precisely than that. How many men are over 50 or whatever the number is where this problem becomes more prevalent, and how do you access them? How do you, what is the market access challenge and the cost of customer acquisition? So there's a whole bunch, you dive a lot deeper and it starts small and it spreads over time, right?
Yeah, but that was a small market, actually. So I like that. I like things like that just to push back on. Because although I agree with you, obviously we have to be thinking about ROI, we have to be thinking about TAM, et cetera. We also have to be cognizant of the fact, which has been brought up earlier, that there is a fair amount of bias, intended and unintended.
Oh, totally.
I can't necessarily fix that, but I can be aware of how this gets back then, how do I communicate? I want to ask a couple of questions that have been asked. One is, does the participation of women in cardiovascular clinical trials reflect their overall participation in clinical trials? across all therapeutic areas, or do you see any differences? And if so, what in your view are some of the unique challenges in CBD to enrolling women in studies? So this gets back to why are women obviously not being enrolled, as one of you pointed out earlier.
Yeah, I think that, we don't get enough women in trials, and that's one of the biggest barriers in cardiovascular research. And I think that, when we design trials, we need to be thinking about what's the prevalence of this disease in the population, how many women are affected, how many men are affected, and design our trials and the numbers that we want to enroll based on that, powered for that, making sure that we get answers for both sexes. And right now, it's often a race to get the trial done. And I understand that from some logistic reasons, because of course, it costs money to do trials, and the quicker that you do them, the better, because then you've got your staff, you've got your team going. Searching for people is a lot of work, but design it right. Look, how are you going to get women? We know during the pandemic, when trials had to become more pragmatic and reduce visits, suddenly those trials that were done during the pandemic enrolled more women. And so we learned, what did women like? Not being disrupted, not going to the hospital. We've got 1,000 other things to do, save us time. We don't have to find childcare to come and do all this stuff, or whatever, parent care, whatever is in their life. They didn't have to disrupt because they just connected by video. So how can we make trials more pragmatic? How can we design trials to be inclusive and adjusting for the prevalence of the disease in the population? And also think about what would it take for a woman to be part of this trial. When we're advertising that we're doing a trial, is there only pictures of men on the pamphlets that you're handing out? Because then men are much more likely to sign up for these trials. And I think that when we do our trials, when we're presenting them to the world, we should be talking. I mean, Stacy and I do this all the time. We look at the trial. The first thing that we probably do when we open a journal, we look at the trial, what % of women, and if not, we're pissed off. Like if it's not enough women, we're mad at the trial list immediately, because we're looking, does this apply to our patients? So if we start designing the trials the right way, if we start asking the right questions, and in some ways catering to women to make sure they're represented. There are examples where we have been able to get women into the trial. Whether you like the trial or not, the Women's Health Initiative showed us that women will come out in masses when we tell them that this is a trial about you and we need answers. They came out in droves across the country, and that trial was a success in terms of enrollment. We know also that women, for example, that conditions that they can understand and appreciate, they also will be there. And a great example of that is obesity trials. Obesity affects women different. We're judged more by our weight and our appearance. Guess what? Women actually really care about excess weight. Those obesity trials were disproportionately enrolling women, except when we did the trials related to cardiovascular disease. Then it was easier to get men into those trials. So, I mean, we have to critically, as a medical community, think about these things. I think also even about our advocacy matters. Women do not understand the risk for heart disease, despite the messages we've been pushing at them. And as much as I have been an advocate for the Red Dress campaign and the Go Red campaign, sometimes we need to step back and think, do we need to rebrand? Why does everyone understand the Pink Ribbon campaign for breast cancer? And every day that I wear my red dress on my lab coat behind me, I get asked on a daily basis in a women's heart clinic, what is that? Why are you wearing a red dress? Like, what does that button mean? So maybe we need to redesign it. Maybe we have to be critical and look at ourselves and try to revamp the messaging so that everyone is on the same page. Because even the things that you were asking Lisa about the funders, part of it is the funders don't understand what this has to do. They think it's a niche market because they don't understand that this is our #1 killer. So you almost have to convince them more with the right data in a way that perhaps we didn't have to do for things that are targeted to men, because in their mind, men are the breadwinners, even though that's not entirely true. Men are, their health matters. And it does. As a society, we are the second sex related to health.
So thank you. And thank you for being open in terms of considering different marketing ideas. It's an area in which I'm quite passionate and quite interested in, because when you track diseases or conditions and how they have changed over the years, over the decades, and you look at AIDS and you look at the little red ribbon, and then you look at breast cancer and you look at the pink ribbon, and you look at Michael Milken spending $1 billion to raise awareness and funding for research in prostate cancer, and it goes on end and end, and I can keep going. What you're looking at is really a merging or a meshing of philanthropy and advocacy. And you need the two in a very major way to create a major shift or change, at least if you look, in my opinion, historically at how changes have taken place, including rare diseases. It's something WHAM is very interested in, because I do think there are opportunities to market differently that we haven't done yet. So stay tuned on that. I do have a quick question, though, Stacey, on obesity and the Ozempic and all of the class of drugs that, of course, is having an impact favorable, I believe, in heart disease. Talk to me a little bit about that. We only have a few minutes left, but I know people are interested in that.
Yeah, no, and I think it reflects the overall importance of continued biomedical research, not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, or that terrible expression, as we live in a world where looking at the value and the cost and the outcome from biomedical research and clinical work is such an important conversation the country and others are having now. I think this is the perfect example of what we can learn from basic science labs to translational opportunities to community-based programming. So, what causes vascular disease? What causes obesity? We always thought of it as, unfortunately, being a lack of will or a weakness, and we never put it into the category of being something to formally study. We look at heart failure and we look at coronary disease, and we think of plaques and being just related to cholesterol or issues related to diabetes. And we've learned through science and translation that there's a whole science of inflammation that can explain so much of disease states that, again, if we didn't ask the questions, we didn't come up with these, novel and often game-changing diagnostic, preventive treatment options. So these classes of drugs, interestingly, have shown us time and time again that not only do they have an impact on obesity, but they also have an impact on glucose, blood sugar control. They have an impact in the right populations on recurrent heart failure events and recurrent heart attacks. We're learning of issues with osteoporosis and improvement with cognition and brain health. So what I love about these medications, GLP-1s or SGLT2 inhibitors, are that they reflect the best of what American and international science is, starting with a hypothesis, funding the work, identifying ways that sex matters. And Martha's right. The irony of these trials is that we had no problem getting women to be involved when it was about obesity and the impression that that was something of a physical appearance, as opposed to a condition that has such a deathly impact on so many people. But the trials that have had amazing game-changing results for us with regard to recurrent heart attacks, heart failure, and other traditional cardiovascular issues, we struggled again to get women. So to me, those drugs are game-changing and reflect what we can do in the science community, in public health. There's population trials looking at this. There's cost analysis, what these agents cost in the US versus, Martha's native Canada. And, but to me, it's a classic example of the science needs to continue, the ecosystem needs to work together, and we have to ask the important questions and not, have blinders on about what causes what and what we can do about it.
But the thing about those drugs that's particularly interesting, I think, is that it wasn't until they started to show real promise in medical conditions that have short-term payback economically that the insurers started to pay for them. And that is the trick, you know, and that's what caused the explosion of payment and thus the market opportunity in the US. And that is the type of thing we need to demonstrate for all conditions. They're all new products and services, that there's a real economic return to the payers and the, you know, those that are related to the payers in order to get adoption. It's just a fact.
At the
Well,
same
Lisa, I would
time,
also.
would just say that, you know, that's good that we can treat when you have disease, but as a preventive
Oh,
cardiologist,
yeah, well,
I would
a
say
whole different
we need
problem.
to be educating our insurers and insurance companies and all of it, that the return would be better if we prevented disease altogether. And that's
It
probably
would be, but it doesn't align with their stock market, you know, turns
But I
models.
think
But
it's
then
in
this,
terms of the
maybe the
economic,
system needs to evolve a bit, right?
Yeah.
Because, and we call that medical, you know, the US health system unfinished. You know,
Word.
nobody would disagree that in the long term, maybe not the next quarter or 2 quarters, this is a smart investment.
Well,
but I would
I
think
would
about,
suggest that this
say
group,
something quickly?
oh, sure, Alicia.
I would just say that in terms of the economic opportunity here with women's heart health is the fact that women are getting diagnosed when it's already too severe. So it's very expensive to the hospital because they come into the ER, and that's expensive for the hospital. They could save a lot of money by early detection, targeted management, and better care for her instead of having her come back with recurring episodes. So I think that's where we make the business case, where if we build the devices and the technologies for early detection that are not working right now, because we see with troponin, they give false negatives. There's a warning sign from the FDA if she's taking multivitamins with biotin, because it's based on biotin technology, right? Or ECG if it's poorly placed on her body because she has breast tissue, right? Like you can have a misdiagnosis. Things that like that still persist in our system when she could have been diagnosed earlier and not have to go home. And we hear this story over and over in all of the Go Red for Women videos, campaigns. Like, I had symptoms, I went to the hospital, I got sent back home, and then I came back with an emergency, right? Like it's the story we hear over and over. And we could do much better for women, right? Like we don't have to diagnose them when it's so severe, it's obvious.
Well, thank you. You know, I could listen and have a discussion with all of you for the rest of the afternoon and be very happy. And I'd like to do that, but not right now because there are people on the line that I think have to go. But let me say this, it's amazing and wonderful to have you collectively talking about these issues. These issues need to be addressed, not only by the 5 of us, but by a much larger group of people. And they need to be addressed in a different way than they're currently being addressed, because they haven't necessarily worked as well as I think we all expect. If I listen to Martha, if I listen to Stacy, and to many of my other friends who I hear loud and clear, this has been going on for a very, 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 very long time. I do believe that there's going to be a massive change in our society that is going to take place. And that has to do with the wealth transfer that'll take place in 2030. That's the largest single wealth transfer that has ever happened, where women, baby boomers, will own 66% of the wealth in this country. I appreciate that, Lisa, that for certain kinds of, in certain moments, we're going to have to definitely build companies and invest in companies the way a guy thinks about it. But I'm going to tell you that I think that a lot of the answers to all of these issues have to do with how women think about their health. And I'm not sure women today, we've heard, obviously, they don't have the necessary information, knowledge that they have to have, education, prevention strategies, all of the things that you've identified. But they also don't necessarily have a way to react, respond, become involved, participate in their health. And I think that that is something that WHAM, along with all of you, is very focused on trying to figure out how to put into motion. I believe that this will happen because 51% of the population wants it to happen, needs it to happen, not because I'm relying on 49% to make it happen. And so I think I might end on that note and just say how appreciative I am And I love the men in my family and I love the men in the world, but women will have to take some ownership, I believe, if we really want to see effective change take place. So thank you all for all that you do to improve the heart health of women. Thank you for all of your support of WHAM. And thank you for joining us today. We really had a wonderful time with you. And I know so many questions went unanswered. And maybe I'll send them off to all of you and we can maybe follow up with some of the answers. So thank you so much.